Okay, so kind of typical but atypical for me to be thankful and to thank everyone in this room for coming. And also, I just want to say I have like so many brothers and dads and uncles in this game, and now I'm getting really old, so the guys at Driveline call me mom. So I also have sons in this game, and I'm just so thankful that I get to present in front of them and alongside them, and I'm just really happy to be here. And I'd like to share a couple of stories about one particular person, that involves one particular person who's in the back of the room holding his second daughter right now. It's Oliver Marmel. And he was there for a couple of really important moments in my career, and I want to share a couple of stories. One story that has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about, and one story that will lead right into what I'm going to talk about. So the first one is my first ever day of working as a full-time professional in professional baseball as a strength and conditioning coordinator for the St. Louis Cardinals. I was really excited to address the entire group because I was excited to be able to practice my Spanish skills that I had learned as an intern with the Cardinals 2 years prior. And I was addressing the entire group of pitchers and catchers that had showed up to spring training as like my first ever day on the job, right? So just like a couple dynamics at work here. It's my first day, and also I'm a girl. So I was pretty nervous, and I was like, I gotta kill this. I'm just gonna like nail this, right? So I'm gonna address this group, and to give you an idea, it's a group of about 60 young men, pitchers and catchers together, and then also the entire staff that was there in spring training. So we're talking about like 30 coaches. And I needed to address the group and say, hey, we're gonna be doing strength and conditioning testing in the gym after the day's done. So it was my turn to speak, and I was outside in the field, addressed the entire group of, let's say, 90 men, and I said, okay, guys, we're gonna do all of the throwing, everything you're gonna do. After you're done throwing, you need to go to the weight room to do your strength testing. Now, here's the time in my story that I need you to do a favor. Everyone needs to write down on their pieces of paper that they have the most important thing, and then you can put your pen down for the rest of the presentation. You need to write down 2 words: tirar, that's T-I-R-A-R, and also you need to write down lanzar, which is L-A-N-Z-A-R. Those are 2 Spanish words, and they both mean to throw. Or at least that's what I thought they both meant. So anyway, I addressed the group in English, and I said, okay, guys, after we're done, you guys are going to go into the weight room, and you're going to do your strength test. And then I said in Spanish, okay, después de tirando, tú vas a ir al gimnasio y vas a hacer tu prueba de fuerza. And I stepped back, and I was like, nailed it. I was like, did you hear that Spanish? Like, it's so good. I'm like on point. Felt really good. My first, talk to the group. I'm like feeling really good about myself. Everyone goes off to their fields. And I start picking up like the cones like a good strength coach would. And I feel someone kind of coming up on me, and I look up, and Oliver Marmel is approaching me at a really alarming rate. And I was like, oh shit. Like, what is this guy about to say to me? Like, oh, I totally messed something up. And he's like, walks up, and he's like this, like his hands are moving. He's like, Rachel, I gotta tell you something. I was like, oh God. I was like, what happened? And he was like, tirar, that means to throw. But also in slang, it means to have sex. So let's just recap. I actually, in my first address ever to a group of professional baseball players as a full-time strength and conditioning coach, said, after you get done having sex, you're going to go to the weight room and do your strength tests. So that was good, which doesn't make any sense if you think about it. They'd be really tired, we wouldn't get the right numbers. So anyway, that's the most important thing I'm going to teach you. From here on out, everyone needs to put their cell phones away. Don't take any pictures or video. You're probably not going to get a copy of these slides. You're not going to get any video of it, so you can just relax and chill, listen to what I have to say, and watch the videos. I'm really grateful to the Houston Astros for letting me show all of these videos, but I would appreciate it if you didn't take any pictures or videos of any of the slides that I'm going to do. And you guys can just relax. Okay. So the second story that I want to tell you about Oliver Marmel and one of the events that he saw was my real first time in addressing a group as an intern strength and conditioning coach 2 years prior to the story that I told you. I had just got done at LSU being a graduate assistant strength and conditioning coach, and I was way up here. I was all the way up. I was extremely intense, and I walked straight into extended spring training Obviously, for those of you who are in professional baseball, you understand what that looks like. If you're not in professional baseball, it looks like a bunch of really young kids who may or may not speak English and are trying to figure out who they are as a human being. So I walked in to stretch the first day, and I got my ass handed to me, and I threw out a lot of coños and probably some F-bombs, and it didn't work very well. And so Oliver Marmol actually saw that happen. He was there on my very first day of work for the St. Louis Cardinals as an intern. Also, if you work in professional baseball, you might be thinking, how in the hell do you teach these kids what a subscapularis is, and also give them the critical thinking skills to understand themselves what it does? We taught them kinesiology, we taught them anatomy, and we let them use critical thinking skills to come to those conclusions. And if you know anything about that group of kids, which I'll explain a lot more about, that's a really difficult task. I'm going to explain, in my opinion, the exact steps that we took to get them there. So Jeremy Barnes already mentioned this. I'm sure people are familiar with this concept, becoming a lot more popular, constraints-led approach. So you change the environment to create the desired action. And we're getting very familiar with this concept in the physical world. But somehow we're still using words to develop character. And so the title of my presentation is Constraints-Led Culture. So how do we create an environment where they have no choice to act in the way and to think in the way that we want them to think? So we put these words on the wall, and like everyone's got their quote. I just love this one. Like, how many guys do you think like walk up to that door and they're like, oh wait, no, today I'm gonna put myself first. So I'll just see you guys later. I'm gonna come back tomorrow. If you're not prepared, just turn around. How many guys do you think actually turned around and like didn't show up to practice that day? Probably no one, right? But the quote's on the door. The quote's on the door. I guarantee you, at some point, the coach was like, "Hey, did you see the door when you walked out here?" You know, like. These words mean nothing, just like we're learning more about how to give proper feedback, that words are very ineffective if you want to create a behavior change, whether that's physical or mental. Another quote that I'm sure that no one pays attention to, and I love this one: play hard, play smart, play together. What does that mean? Like, what do those words actually mean? You know, you can put those words on the wall, you can put them on a t-shirt, but that's like putting swing decisions on a t-shirt. If you put swing decisions on a t-shirt, it doesn't mean that you're going to have better swing decisions. You actually have to do something to get there. Here's the question that I want to present and answer, and I underlined and highlighted these things on purpose. How do we get groups of people to do things that are difficult, different, and sometimes even disliked? So anyone can get one person to do something that's easy. But when you add on all these constraints and different things that you have to think about, especially the group thing, because we're not working with individuals most of the time. You might be working with one person in the cage, but at the end of the day, you're trying to get them to all reach a common goal. We have to think about the group perspective. So how did I figure out what I was going to say today, and how did I come to the conclusions personally that I've come to create behavior change in groups? I'm sure we're all familiar with this picture. It's the haka from the New Zealand All Blacks. And I came across this concept, or I started really diving deep and thinking about the concept of dynasties. How does somebody manufacture the exact same product year after year after year after year? So what I did was a little bit of research, which I was disappointed in. I looked up the top 10 Google searches for the top 10 dynasties, and I came up with a lot of names, and I wrote them all down. I was looking at them. I actually created an Excel sheet, and how many years this coach was there, and how many championships they had, like how many times they've been in the playoffs, records. I started making this Excel sheet. And I was pretty disappointed to find out that the dynasty that I've actually drawn the most from personally as a coach was only listed one time in this entire little mini research study I was doing as I was trying to put together this presentation. So let me pose a question. Just think in your minds. What if somebody, a research institution or a professor, repeated the exact same study 30 times in a row, year after year after year, and 21 times out of 30, they came up with the exact same result? So again, a professor at a research institution, 30 years, they did the exact same study and with different participants and came up with the exact same result 21 times. And then the other 9 times, they got pretty close. That's what Anson Dorrance has done. Who's Anson Dorrance? He's the UNC women's soccer coach. 21 national championships in 30 years. That's pretty good. So when we talk about research, it's pretty interesting to think about what we do as coaches and also what coaches have done and especially the coaches who have created dynasties and who have manufactured the exact same product every single year over a long period of time. If you're going to write down one book, this is like a coaching Bible of mine that was recommended to me by some of the men in this room. I actually changed what I did, and a lot of the things that I'm going to show you in these videos is based off of some of the things that I learned about in this book and that he does. He also, this is something that you would learn if you read the book or just looked into his background. On top of winning 21 national championships in 30 years, is pretty good. He also literally built women's soccer from the ground up in the United States of America, and I'm pretty confident that we wouldn't have these iconic photos if it wasn't for that man. So creating change in a group, as small as a UNC women's soccer team, and also large as the United States of America, is a specialty of this man. So, after studying dynasties and obsessing over these things, I know a lot of people in this room, I imagine you guys like obsess at home over like what brand of PVC pipe you're going to use to do your PVC pipe drills. Like should I go with the Rogue PVC pipe, or Alico has a pretty good one, and I'm more of a Home Depot girl myself, but I really obsess and lose sleep over culture. So I've studied a lot of these coaches. I've watched videos, listened to podcasts, read their books, etc. I try to pick up the things in between. It's not as easy as going to Google Scholar and looking up a research study, but if you spend time to tease out some things and some commonalities between these coaches, you can really get a good idea of an actual system and a process that's used commonly across all those coaches that I listed, all those teams that I listed. So this is what I've put together. This is something that I made up. It's not necessarily research-based, but it's coaching research-based. Small societies, tribe. Tribe is not like hashtag tribe. Tribe is an actual concept that's been researched and is talked about in books. If you put people in a small area, they're going to act kind of similar. So I'm going to talk about that a lot. Group competition, the secret sauce. Everyone knows competition draws something different out of players than would just a normal practice. Detailed high standards and detailed steps to meet those standards. So I talked about point A and point B. How do you get people from point A to point B? You can't just say, here's my detailed standards, here's my detailed point B, this is what I want you to look like, this is how I want you to act, and then not give them exact steps of how to get there. Frequent and massive failure. Failure has to be baked into in my opinion, has to be baked into every single practice, and it has to be really hard. Not just like, oh, I mishit a ball, but like, maybe you should feel like you want to die once a week, or that you feel bad about yourself once a week. You need to get to that point where there's some kind of failure that makes you question how good you are as a human being weekly, and then be able to climb out of that, which I'm going to talk about. And then exclusivity. You can't play with us. There has to be some kind of standard that if it's not met, you're out. We can't include everyone. If you're at the high school level, great, include everyone. But if you want to win games, you can't let people hang around. And those are all concepts that they are my opinion now, but I've teased out of all of this obsessing over culture and researching dynasties. So back to the question, how do we get groups of people to do the things that are difficult and different and sometimes even disliked? Research experiment number 1, July 2nd mindset orientation. So I listed out the dynasty concepts that I mentioned, and we applied them to the July 2nd mindset orientation, which I'll explain in just a second. The top 3 are the most important concepts, and then we went to also group competition and small societies. I'm going to explain 2 experiments, and each one has a little bit different priorities. Participants, this is important. If you're not in professional baseball, you probably don't know what July 2nd means. July 2nd is the International Signing Day for all international players, mostly Latin American players, but also Australian, Japanese, wherever they're coming from in the world. If they're an international player, they're going to sign on July 2nd. So what we got is, I was the Latin American strength and conditioning coordinator for the Houston Astros, and we signed about 30 kids. And at the time, this seemed very unfortunate, but then it allowed us to have an actual control group. So basically what happened is we had about 30 kids sign, and we had 10 kids that the organization decided they needed to have play in games immediately, which meant they weren't going to participate in a mindset orientation. They were going to go and play with the players who had already been playing, whether that was because they were a prospect and they felt they needed to get them in games, or it was because they just needed extra players. 10 of those kids were going to miss out on an initial orientation, and they were going to be going to play directly with the older kids, which older means 18, but these kids are 16 years old, so they are older. The other group that we had was 20 kids, and we put them through an intensive 6-week mindset orientation in which our entire goal was to lay the foundation for detailing our standards and giving them an exact process of how they can meet those extremely high standards. And in addition to that, we also wanted to make sure that we were handing them strategies to make sure that they could fail, and in turn that they were confident they could learn complex concepts because they were okay failing at learning those things. That was the entire goal of this orientation. So we had 10 players that were of the same age in the same group. They were basically 16 years old across the board. 10 players that were not going to participate in that, and 20 that did. That comes into play later when I explain how we measured this. Point A to point B. I think several people have mentioned this in their presentation. We needed to get these kids from a point A that was different probably than most kids that we think about or that we've coached in the past. And it's also why I love working with the Latin American players. Some of the kids are at the bottom of the pyramid. They literally depend on coming to the complex in their professional organization to get 3 good meals. So they are literally at the bottom of the pyramid needing those physiological needs that they don't even have. So if those kids don't have those needs met, how can we possibly ask them to get to self-actualization at the top of the pyramid? How can we get them from point A at the bottom of the pyramid to point B at the top? How can we talk to them about teamwork if we are not fulfilling those bottom needs? It's impossible. They can't truly care about another person if they're worried about getting 3 meals a day. It's impossible. So how are we getting from point A to point B in a very detailed fashion? Once they're at the complex, which again, all of these 30 guys or the 20 guys that participated in the orientation, once they're at the complex, they have those 3 meals a day met. They're in a relatively safe place. We can move them on to the next level of this pyramid. Safety needs. So again, I think people oftentimes understand what safety really means. You think safety like, okay, I'm not gonna die, that's safety. But safety always also means structure. It means just feeling safe in the space that you're in. And Jeremy talked about this a little bit, is just really understanding what is going to get you in trouble and what's going to get you praise. Having a set structure to understand where you are as a person and where you stand with authority, giving them personal security. So that's actually, their physiological needs were met once they got to the complex. The next thing was giving them those safety needs, so they had a perfectly laid out structure to understand where they stood with authority and where they stood with themselves. And then we can move up the chain, hopefully, to self-actualization later. But before we do that, it's impossible to expect kids this age with some of the limitations that they're coming with to jump to self-actualization and talk about teamwork. So I put all of the words that are going to be on the screen basically in these videos is to remind you, this is a concept from those dynasty concepts, and I color-coded them to remind you of what priority we were putting on them. So for this 6-week orientation, our entire focus was giving them extremely detailed standards and extremely detailed steps to get to those standards, and then getting them to work together was an end result. How many times have you told a player to hustle? Just think about it in your mind. Before I did this, I probably told a player to hustle 1 million times. And then all I did was say, okay, everyone, 5 seconds to get to the cones, or you're coming back to me and we're doing it again. And it literally took like 1 or 2 times, and they all did it. It's so simple. I just gave them a very detailed instruction. Instead of saying hustle is a very esoteric word. It doesn't have any numbers to it that they can understand. 5 seconds to go to the cones, go. I don't even have to say the word hustle. I just give them a detailed explanation of how they can accomplish a goal. They weren't allowed to lift for several weeks. We just had them watch. And I think this is it's common in the weight room at times, but it's also common with coaches. We have to get them in games. We have to get them reps. We have to get them playing. You don't have to do any of that. What you have to do is make sure that when they get into the games, they're doing quality things. You don't have to rush to do anything, really. What you have to rush to do is give them the details and give them the steps. So all we did was have them watch, and then eventually we started teaching them very basic concepts about lifting. Detailed high standards, this was us explaining to them what collegiate strength and conditioning is. And first we had to explain to them what college athletics is, because in Latin American countries, college athletics does not exist. Think about that. So they are 16 years old and they have no idea what their American counterparts are doing. We had to explain to them where their American counterparts were coming from and what they were about to come into when they got to the United States and turn 18, and their competition is a freshman who's been through a year of strength and conditioning, or it's a sophomore or a junior, or it's a senior who's been through 4 years of strength and conditioning and extreme stringent standards in the collegiate sporting world, and that's what they're going to go meet. So we have to prepare them to compete against those kids and also just to understand where they're coming from. They had no concept of college athletics. They don't know how to get to the top of the pyramid. They don't know how to get from point A to point B. Did they like it? No. Did they hate me sometimes? Yeah. It doesn't matter. Do your kids hate you sometimes? Yeah. Do you care? No. Because when they're 30, they're going to look back and be like, dang, that was really smart. No kids like to eat their vegetables. This is another thing. Come into the weight room with a plan. Come into the cage with a plan. Hey, what are you going to do today? I assume this is the exact same thing that I've dealt with for 10 years in the weight room, right? They come to the weight room. They haven't looked at the program. They have no idea what they're doing. They put 225 on the bar, and they're like, yeah, I'm ready to go. We have them come into the weight room. They have a plan sheet to fill out. They can't start their lift until we've come to the board. We've talked about what we want to accomplish, and then they themselves fill out their plan. They have to show their plan to a coach. Does this take time? Oh my God, so much time, so much energy, but if you don't spend it on the front end, you're going to spend it on the back. Failure strategies. So Sue Enquist is a famous UCLA softball coach, and she has won a lot of national championships. She's one of the dynasties that I've paid attention to. I saw her speak a few years ago, and she talked about failure strategies. She actually would make drills so difficult that she knew the players were going to fail about 70% of the time. A lot. That's a lot of failure. But the key component that I took away from her talk is not that she made drills hard, because we're all talking about how practice needs to be harder. But we're not talking about how we need to define a failure strategy. So she gave me this idea. She said that their failure strategy was that they would touch their chest, say, my bad, and move on. That was what they did. Anytime they made an error or made a mistake, in practice, they would do that. And then also they were expected to do it on the field. So I started to teach these guys failure strategies. Our dynamic warm-up was so stringent, and we had such high levels of standards for these kids that I knew they were going to mess it up. We purposely tried to make them mess it up, but then we also purposely gave them a failure strategy when they did mess it up. They're afraid to fail because they don't know how to handle it. But if you give them that secondary emotion, that ability to fail, and you literally just hand them, like I had to coach them on failure. I can't just say, we come back to this is constraints-led culture. I had to give them the strategy. I had to create the environment where they're going to fail and give them the strategy. How many times have you said to a player, hey, have good body language? I said it a million times. But the second I started giving them a failure strategy, it changed. I didn't have to say it anymore because they had a secondary emotion that was immediate. The coolest thing about this is I was in the dugout one time, and I had a player. He made an error at shortstop. One of these kids, they play games 2 or 3 times a week in during this time period when they're first signed. And there was a shortstop who made an error, and he knew I was in the dugout. He kind of glanced over at me, and he turned out to his team, and he raised his hand, and he said, my bad, on the field. And I was like, I lost it. I was so proud. How cool is that it transferred out? I gave them that failure strategy, and they were understanding that this is how it works. When I fail, I don't freak out. I don't throw my glove. I don't kick the dirt. I have a very simple strategy to go to, even when it's a difficult situation. So, we have a little saying at Driveline, show me the data. If you work for the Astros, or you work in professional baseball, or you even have a clue what's going on in professional baseball, you understand that nothing matters unless you can measure it. So, we measured it. We sat all 30 kids down. 10 of them were the control group that were not part of this orientation. 20 of them were in the orientation. We sat all 30 of them down. I asked them the exact same question. I said, tell me 3 things that you learned over the past 6 weeks. And then I let them talk on video. And then we recorded each time somebody said something, it got recorded. And we charted how many times things were said. So on the right, you're going to see in green all of the mental things that were said. On the left, you've got the physical things. I'm sure this isn't going to come as a surprise. The results were the control group, 81.48% mentions of learning physical concepts. In the orientation group, 91.5% of the time, on their own, I said, what are the 3 things that you learned? On their own, they said they learned mental concepts. So it worked like a charm. If you say you don't have time for an orientation process, if you say you don't have time to detail these things out, if you catch yourself saying, I need to get this kid in games, I need to get him at bats, I need to get him in the weight room, I need to get him, whatever. If you catch yourself saying you don't have time to teach these concepts, I would just argue and say you don't have time to not do this process. You don't have time to not create detail. You don't have time to not teach them how to fail. Because otherwise, you're never going to get to these concepts. You're going to take years and years of your time. You're going to be like me. You're going to be screaming coño, and you're going to be upset. And you're probably going to blame them. How many times have you blamed a player? Oh, he's just lazy. He doesn't want to be here. He doesn't get it. How many times have you said that? It's a very easy trap to fall in, but it's always your fault. It's good news. It's always your fault. You're in control of the environment, which means you can change the behavior. Second research experiment. Small societies and the competitive cauldron strength camp. So in this particular experiment, we focused on putting these guys in extremely small groups, forming groups around leaders, creating a competition basically of every single moment of their day, exclusivity, and then of course 4, 5, and 6, those were all present. Those are the things that we focused on when we had orientation, we had new players. The top 3 are what we really focused on for strength camp. The participants were 50 players. This is important. The way that this went down is usually this strength camp that was hosted after the season was over was made of kind of a hodgepodge of players. It was like whoever the coaches wanted to be there, and then maybe the organization would send like some prospects, and then when the AFL guys needed to get ready to go to the Arizona Fall League, we would have some older guys thrown in there. And I said, no, we're cutting it to 50 players. We're deciding who earned it, and if you didn't earn it, you're not going to come. Sometimes players want to go home after the season is done, but again, in this case, you got to remember that some of these kids are not going home to the best situations. So it's actually a privilege, and it's a good thing for them to want to stay at the complex so they can get good meals, they can be in a safe place, they can be with their teammates, they can get access to a great gym, access to coaches. It's a privilege. So we wanted to make it such a thing that you had to earn it to be there. We left some kids out that actually came to our office crying and begging to be in the camp. And we said you should have earned it in the season. Exclusivity is important. If it's not a privilege, if you don't consider what you're doing a privilege and you don't hold the standard, the quality is going to suffer. The second major concept is small societies. Again, this is tribal. This is a concept that's been researched for a long time. Tribal tendencies are real. If you put people in a small group, they're going to act somewhat the same. These 2 pictures are taken in a remote village in Laos that's not on Google Maps, and then on the left, and then on the right, that's in Southeast Asia. And on the right, you've got a picture of, I got lost on a road trip a few months ago in France, and I ended up in this super small town in France, and I just started to notice, if you travel to these small communities all over the world, you could travel to a podunk town in the United States, everyone's going to have somewhat of the same rituals. Right, you go to the coffee house in the morning, you got the group of guys or the group of ladies that's having their coffee, everyone knows each other, there's a market, people's doors are unlocked, they're wide open, they're hanging their laundry outside. It's a very old-timey type of feel, because everyone acts the same in a small town. If you put yourself in the environment of a small town, eventually you're going to have those tendencies. I have a story about a small society. So in this village in Laos, I had an opportunity to go there almost 2 years ago and teach English. And I was in the volunteer house alone by myself. Doors are open, windows are open. It was super cold outside, so we're kind of letting some hot air come in. I was by myself, and I was reading. I had my head down, and all of a sudden I felt like a presence in the doorway, and I look up, and there was a man standing in the doorway just staring at me. And I was like, I'm going to die. Like, my first thought was just like, hair stood up on the back of my neck. I kind of jumped up, and I was like, I'm either going to kill this guy or I'm going to run out the back door. Like, I'm ready to fight. Like, I'm just ready to die right now. And he just stared at me, and he pointed, and he goes, you, beer lao. And I'm like, what? No one speaks English. No one speaks English in this town. Not a single word. I'm like, what? I just stood there. I was like, I don't think he's going to kill me. Like, what's going on right now? And he's like, you, beer lao. The guy's invited me over to have a drink, and I thought he was going to kill me. The point of me telling you this story is these are pictures of me drinking some kind of, I think, homemade alcohol out of like a clay pot. No, I didn't get sick. It's just a miracle. The point of me telling you this is, like, we're so messed up in the United States that I actually thought this guy was here to kill me, and he was the neighbor inviting me over to have a drink and being, like, hospitable to me. This is how a small society functions. You leave your doors open, everyone cares about everyone, there's very little disparity of wealth. Everyone's just there to help everyone. So we apply this concept to Strength Camp. Again, I put this slide in here to stop myself, but also to remind you, how do we get groups of people to do things that are difficult, different, and sometimes disliked? The answer that I have is no snowflakes. This is totally counterculture right now, right? Everyone's an individual. There's 50 different types of athletes. We have to treat them all differently. We have to, they're all special snowflakes, and we can't hurt anyone's feelings, and everyone's included, and everyone's different. And my answer to that is, I'm tired of hearing about snowflakes. I want to talk about snowmen, okay? All of these snowmen are different, and they're all made up of a bunch of snowflakes, but at the end of the day, you can't tell that there's snowflakes there anymore. There's snowmen. So how do we do this in Strength Camp? We wanted zero individuality. We wanted them to become their own little societies and take on their own little personalities within their teams. So again, if you'll remember, we had 50 players. All of the players from the July 2nd orientation were there, and then also some older players, okay? So what we did, the first thing we did is identify the leaders. We didn't say we're going to have 5 teams in Strength Camp and then pick the leaders. We identified the leaders of those 50 kids, and then we said we're going to have 5 teams. So it was very important that we had a tribal leader that we thought the kids could follow. We had a leader, and then we identified sub-leaders. Those became the peer council. This was a key component, and it was absolutely phenomenal to see these kids take on these personalities once we let them go. We created a peer council. That's from the book Legacy, about the All Blacks. We communicated as little as possible with the entire group. We only communicated with these leaders of the groups, and we told them it was their responsibility to disseminate the information to the rest of the group. So we said, you're the leader. It's your job to get everyone there on time, in the right place, at the right time, and tell them what's going on. We're not talking to your team. It's your team. Go. And it was just amazing to see these 18-year-olds do what they did, which I'll show in a second. We also identified the weak links, and we spread them out. So once we identified 5 leaders, we had 5 teams of 10. Then we identified the weak links, and we spread them out so that one team didn't have 5 guys that we thought were going to struggle a little bit with the strength camp. We spread them out so there was one person on the team, and I'm going to come back to that. So, small societies. So once we created the small societies, we had to sit down as coaches and say, what do we want to measure? And really it was all based around character. We did no physical achievements as points. We created the point system, the competitive cauldron. It was all based around character things. So basically a coach could, at any time of the day, say, hey, you just did something great. You just improved your character. You got a point for your team. So a couple of examples I have up there. Something as simple as picking up a piece of trash off of the ground. I know if any of you guys have visited, if anyone here has visited a Latin American country, you understand that there's very little rules. And there's a lot of trash on the ground sometimes. So they throw trash on the ground. That's what they do. It's fine. That's normal in their society. So if we want to change that behavior, we had to reward them for doing something different. If they pick up a piece of trash off the ground, it's plus 1 point for their team. If anyone sees anyone throw a piece of trash on the ground, it's -5. If you're late, it's -10. We came up with this extensive point system to create a competitive cauldron, and they were getting graded all day long on things that are very difficult for them to do. Every single day we would tally up the points, and they were on the board, and that board was a very busy place during strength camp. Everyone was checking the board. There were arguments about points. They were yelling at me about points. They got extremely into it, and they were extremely ecstatic over time in their small societies for gaining even the smallest things. I love this quote. You can be an architect of the moments that matter. The Power of Moments. I already mentioned that book. I love it. We can be the architect of these moments so easily if you pay attention to how you grade them. If you grade something and you put them in a competition situation, they can't help themselves. They're gonna do it. It's impossible. This is probably one of my favorite things about strength camp that we did, which was not well accepted at first. When I brought this up to the powers that be, they said, no, we're not gonna do this. This is not a punishment camp. We don't wanna do this to these kids. They're not gonna do this. I created what I called pride duties. So it wasn't chores, it was pride duties. It was being prideful and taking pride in where you live and the people that are helping you. And so this is one example. These are kids in the cafeteria. They serve food to their teammates, and they also mopped the floors. They helped clean the bathrooms. They cleaned the weight room. Any kind of chores around the complex that could be done, we had them doing it. Every single week, we would sit down with the peer council. We would give them a schedule of what they needed to do as far as their pride duties, and the peer council was then in charge of filling in the schedule and making sure that they showed up on time and that they were doing the duties that were asked by the actual staff. So we were working with the cafeteria staff. We were working with the cleaning ladies, and I basically checked in at the end of the week with the cafeteria and the cleaning ladies to see how they did, and they would earn points for their teams based off of if they showed up on time, how they did with their job. Even the cafeteria people were in on this competitive cauldron. Exclusivity. So there was a time in the camp, I don't have a video for this, but there was a time in the camp where we were probably 3 or 4 weeks in, and like the small societies were formed. And it was pretty tight. Like they were competing. You saw some of the videos I showed. The competition was tight. They were arguing with me about points. It was probably the easiest time. It was the hardest time as a coach and the easiest time as a coach because I didn't have to do anything. I just set them in place and then they went, right? So interesting things started to happen is that we had one of the weak links that I mentioned that I kind of spread out those guys that I thought might have a problem with doing these things. One of the teams, the team leader and the sub leader came to me and said, Rachel, we really want to kick this guy out of camp. He can't play with us. And so I listened, and I knew right away when they came to me, I wasn't gonna argue with them. I wasn't gonna save this kid. Because I had empowered them to be leaders. I had empowered them to make their own decisions. And they came to me and had this like organized thought process. They listed out what they thought he did wrong. And I was seeing this, of course. Like I was seeing this happen. But it was amazing that they came to me and wanted to kick this guy off of their team and actually out of camp. And he did. He went home. And that was their decision. It wasn't the coach. Like this is such an important thread of this. It wasn't me getting mad at people. It wasn't me being the authority person. I think everyone in this room has either played on a team or coached on a team, a championship team, a high-level team, where the coach almost becomes irrelevant and it's run by the players. And I think that is actually like an ultimate goal of a coach, is that you don't even have to really say much anymore because the players are doing it themselves. But you have to create a structure to empower players to be able to do that. All right, that was strength camp. So before you ask this question, because it's probably on everyone's mind, okay, that's cool. Like they're 16, they're in the Dominican, like they're kids, it's really fun, super, strength camp, woo, super fun. What about veterans? Like, what happens when you got to deal with older players? Mithridatism is basically if you feed someone poison over a long period of time with little bit of amounts, you're going to be able to make them immune to that certain poison. So when I was in AA for the Astros, it wasn't like feeding them poison, but we still did the same thing, essentially. Like I had a competition going all season long for both position players and pitchers. And I just based it around things that I wanted to change. So for the pitchers, it was conditioning. I put them in small societies, and I made them compete. And again, it's like, yes, do they like it? Not all of them, but they can't help themselves, right? So I had 12 pitchers, 4 teams of 3 guys. We tracked every single time that they ran, which means when they were running poles, they weren't running them at 1 minute and 30 seconds. They were running them at 23 seconds because they wanted to talk shit to the other players. Pretty simple. Small societies, competition, and I think also another key ingredient, of course, which every minor league player loves and needs, is money. So I was also fortunate enough that the Astros gave me a little bit of extra cash that I could fund this competition. And at the end of every month, there was a winner between these teams. And so you saw, ultimately, again, like we're talking about older guys. Did everyone go hard all the time in every situation? Did they all like it? They all buy in? And, there was no jumping around and screaming like you saw in these videos. But I will say, even if I took them from running 10% of their conditioning hard to running 60% of it, that's a huge leap. So can this be done with older guys? I really do think it can be done. I saw it done already, and I know that if I had more time and we were implementing this at a deeper level, then it would be even better. The position players, base running competition. So pretty much every single day that we were at home, we timed them in their 10-yard starts, and we had them work off of a fake pitcher and time up their starts out of a base stealing stance. And I videoed it, and then I gave them points. I had them in teams of 3, and I was giving them points every single day based on this little mini tiny competition that took 3 minutes of doing their 10-yard starts 3 times. And then also in games, if they stole a base, they got a point. Did it work? Yes. During a game one time, we were losing by like 5 or 6 runs, and a guy stole a base, and one of actually the oldest guy on the team, who's like 28 years old, stood up on the top step, and he was like, "That's my teammate!" We're like losing in the middle of this game, and he's excited about getting a point for his base running team. So does it work? Yes. Is it different? Yeah, you gotta obviously take into consideration some different things, but again, there's value to this no matter what, because this is all rooted in behavioral psychology concepts. They really can't help themselves if you give them the right environment. So this thank you is a little bit different one. These are the coaches that helped me put on the strength camp and the mindset orientation. And it was hard. It was really hard. There's a lot of challenges that come in working in that environment. It was extremely difficult. It took so much energy. And when I brought up these ideas to these coaches, not only did they help, but they actually added a lot of value and ideas to what we were doing. And they completely bought in. And I absolutely could not have pulled either of those things off if they weren't there. And also the Houston Astros for letting me do those things that are a little bit counterculture in some ways, and for letting me show these videos, and just for hiring me. I'm gonna glaze over this because this isn't how I came to any of these conclusions. However, it should be mentioned that these are concepts that like I didn't make up, and actually the coaches of the dynasties, they didn't make them up either. This is just how humans act, and if you put humans in a certain situation, you talk to them a certain way, you give them a certain expectation, they're going to raise to the level of expectation that you give them. So I don't think it's any secret, but sometimes some coaches might say that these kids are not capable of learning the things that I showed you in these videos, and obviously I don't believe that. But if a coach did believe that they weren't capable, the player has no chance. The player's not gonna go and say, "Hey, I wanna learn anatomy and kinesiology, can you teach me?" They're not gonna do that. So if we view them as not being able to learn those things, they have no chance to do it. These are some books that I've drawn off of. Some of them are coaching books. Some of them are behavioral psychology books. That top one on the right, Tribe by Sebastian Junger, that's a really great one about small societies, the behavioral psychology that goes into small societies. And then these are my actual references. These are like the people that have shaped me into the coach that I am. And I would say this is the most powerful thing that's gotten to me personally from point A to point B. And lastly, I want to show this. This is like, I debated whether or not to add this in here, but this is a good example of how I've come a long way in my coaching, and also how I was able to help a kid get from his point A to his point B, because I was getting from my point A to my point B. This is Anoli Paredes. He was just signed to the 40-man. He was just added to the 40-man roster. And he hated me so much when I first got to the Astros. Man, we fought. I was still kind of in like the Conyo stage. Like I was still just like going at people. I was still not letting that go. And I started to talk to him individually about failure strategies. And I just think like my personal journey with him taught me a lot about how I want to do more things from a broad scope, and talking about groups and how we can apply this to bigger groups. But this is by far my biggest accomplishment, is taking a kid who every time he had a bad outing, he was throwing his glove, pouting in the dugout as long as he could, as loud as he could for everyone to see. He was struggling. He had an injury that they thought was going to be a career-ending injury. Came back from that. He signed to the 40-man, and the thing about him that really was special is that I was able to teach him how to fail, and I was pushing him to his brink and then building him up. So I had this incredibly high standards for him, and also was, again, giving him those detailed steps of how to get there. And that little girl in the picture, her name is Emily Rachel. He named his daughter after me. So this is my point B, getting to this point. I'm done. Does anyone have any questions?
We got time for a couple questions.
So I imagine that, in addition to the desire for exclusivity, you don't want any of your players to fail. And so the question is kind of how you kind of combine those two. Or so you said with the strength camp, they had
Yeah.
to earn the right to attend. What happens if everybody clears it or all but one? Do you raise the bar or include everyone?
Yeah, like you're asking. That was like dichotomous. I'm like, oh, we're gonna teach them how to fail and like get everyone to the same place and blah blah blah. But like at the end of the day, you saw what I'm doing for these guys, or what the coaches were doing for these guys. And so if you still fail after that, there's a certain cutoff. Like it's a timeline. So it seems as if we're giving most of the people the opportunity to succeed in those situations, but they have to understand at some point, you can't play with us anymore. We've set a very clear expectation. We've given all of the resources, all of the steps, all of the specific ways to get there. And all of these guys get it. But maybe this little 10% doesn't. It's equally as important in my mind to have exclusivity for both of those groups, to understand that the guys who did buy in and got to those places, they see if they don't do that, they earned the right. But those guys didn't. So I have to, as a coach, as a manager of change, I have to draw the line. And if they're not going to come over here, they're gone. For the good of the greater group, for those 80% or 90% of people that did buy in, because what am I saying? Like, oh, I have all these standards, and blah, like we're gonna work really hard and blah blah blah, blah. And then somebody continuously, even though I've given everybody the same instruction, I've given them multiple chances, I've given them all of these details of how to get there. These guys didn't buy in, didn't get it, but I'm still gonna let them participate. I mean, this happens all the time if you think about it, right? Work really hard, blah, 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 coach, hashtag growth mindset, hashtag blah, blah, blah. And then, oh, but actually he's a pretty good player, so we're going to let him stick around. Happens all the time. You have to send a message to both those people and also to the group that is buying in that you will hold the standard and you will give them the opportunity to get there. But if they're not holding it, they're out.
I don't necessarily have a question, but a statement. I think what you've done and what you presented to us today goes far beyond just baseball. That you're setting down a foundation for these kids for the rest of their lives, because we know that every one of them won't have an opportunity to advance to the major leagues and fulfill their goals. But the underlying foundations that you're providing these kids is just amazing. So much so, I sent a text message to my kids to create a competition back home to see who would actually have buy-in. I thought it was just a tremendous thing that I picked up today. I want to thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks. I don't care about baseball, really. You can write that down in your favorite. I'm not a baseball fan. I played softball in college, but that's not why I'm in the game. I'm really, like I said, I lose sleep over organizational culture, and also from a much broader perspective of making an impact in the game. It's as simple as that. Like making an impact in the game to change the game, to empower. I hope, I just blew your mind. Like I hope that you think differently about those kids so that we can raise the level for them. We can raise their idea of what they're capable of doing. I wouldn't be standing here if, there's so many men in this room that have helped me that if they looked at me and they're just like, oh, that's a girl, like, yep, she's a girl. Like, okay, she can go be in softball or do whatever girls do. Like, I wouldn't be here. But they don't view me like that. So they set my ceiling higher. I build the house. As a coach, I build the house. And I can either build a mansion for these kids or I can build a little hut. And whatever I build, they're going to live inside of it. So, yeah, I mean, what you said is just like, I don't care about baseball. I care that these kids are being good to their daughters and their wives, and reaching potential probably that they couldn't even imagine themselves.